G'day everyone, my name's Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on this webinar today. During the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary. And you can find all those details on our website at tai.org.au/webinars. And just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists today. And you should also be able to upvote questions and make comments. Please make sure to keep things civil in the chat or we'll remove you. And finally, this discussion is being recorded and it will be posted up on our website and emailed to everyone who is registered for today's webinar once we've finished. So for over 80 years, Australia and East Timor have been joined together, mostly in conflict and struggle. In World War II, Sparrow Force resisted the Japanese invasion in February 1942 with the help of the East Timorese, only to be overcome after a few days. And thereafter, again, with the help of the East Timor, Australia conducted guerrilla operations for a couple of years. The people of East Timor could have betrayed Australian forces, but instead paid a heavy price, with between 40 and 60,000 East Timorese people dying in Japanese reprisals. The post-war years were lean years in East Timor. Decolonisation was slow, and it wasn't until 1974 that Portuguese control crumbled, enabling Indonesia to occupy East Timor in 1975. During the Indonesian incursions, 5 Australian journalists were murdered at Balibo, and in the ensuing quarter century, well over 100,000 East Timorese died in what some commentators have called a genocide. Indonesia's control collapsed in 1999. And in September that year, Australia led a UN peacekeeping force to help restore law and order and to assist in the transition to independence on the 20th of May 2002. One of the key figures of Timor-Leste's fight for independence was José Ramos-Horta, His Excellency José Ramos-Horta, Timor-Leste's first foreign minister, third prime minister, and fourth president. He was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996 and survived an assassination attempt in 2008. And we are privileged to have His Excellency José Ramos-Horta join us on our webinar this morning. And we're also privileged to welcome Bernard Collaery to participate as well, alongside Alan Beam, head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program. Bernard is very well known to most Canberrans and has acquired even greater international prominence as counsel for a witness in a case conducted before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, where the government of Timor-Leste brought an action against the Australian government that has subsequently been referred to as the Australia-East Timor spying scandal. Bernard is the son of an Australian World War II fighter pilot who was killed in action before Bernard was born, and he graduated law from Sydney University Law School and was a diplomat serving in Paris. He was the second Deputy Chief Minister and second Attorney General of the ACT, and he subsequently founded Collaery Lawyers and has led high-profile cases, including on the 1997 Thredbo landslide, the 2003 Canberra bushfires, and others. But it is really as legal advisor to the former ACIS officer turned whistleblower Witness K that Bernard Collaery has become best known. Four Corners described how Witness K and Bernard Collaery have been accused of disclosing an Australian bugging operation carried out in the government offices of Timor-Leste in 2004 by the Australian government. And it was years after the revelations became public that they were both charged. Both are charged under Section 39 of the Intelligence Services Act 2001, which deems it a criminal offence for a person to communicate any information that was prepared by Australian secret intelligence services in pursuit of its functions. And the Australia Institute today released research showing that of all Five Eyes countries, Australia's oversight of its intelligence community is the weakest. After an ACT Supreme Court ruling significant parts of the trial against Bernard Collaery will be held in secret, a development that the Professor of Law and Alan Myers Chair of Law, Spencer Zifkak, has described as one of the gravest threats to freedom of expression. This matter is currently before the courts and Bernard is subject to suppression orders. And for that reason, today's webinar is subject to a couple of important procedural conditions. First, because Bernard is not permitted to comment on matters relating to his case that are currently before the Supreme Court of the ACT, I will not be accepting questions that specifically refer to that matter. And secondly, because some aspects of the matter currently underway in the ACT Supreme Court may involve the earlier case before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, I will not be accepting questions that refer to what is known as the Australia East Timor spying scandal. But what I will certainly invite are questions relating to Australia's relationship and history with East Timor, our foreign policy, our intelligence services and their conduct, and questions on broader principles relating to legal representation in international tribunals and other courts, specifically where national security information might operate. So welcome again, Mr. Ramos-Horta, Bernard and Alan, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'll start with a question to you, Mr. Ramos-Horta, and thank you again for joining us. But if I can start with you, how would you view the quality of Australia's foreign policy relationship with Timor-Leste?
Obviously, I put aside events before 99. Since 99, we all know, prompted by the Australian public, Australian people across the world, by the irreversible developments in Indonesia, the fall of Suharto and the dawn of the democracy there in the archipelago, and the ground swelling of international sympathy, support. Australia had a very active role at the United Nations, and we, the powers that be at that time, to marshal that interfaith international force for Timor-Leste. And since, after that, Australia has been thoroughly engaged with Timor-Leste in the early years of humanitarian situation, the need to rebuild, to assist the people, the poverty in the country, building institutions, etc. Australia's support has been multidimensional. Of course, it is in the midst of all of these that goodwill generated in Timor-Leste internationally towards Australia in regard because of Australian intervention and the enormous support to Timor-Leste, that a dark cloud descended on that relationship. Of course, we were not aware that the same time as we were showing tremendous gratitude to Australia, the Australian government authorized order bugging of our government offices to spy on the Timorese government, and then in order to gain advantage on the negotiations on the Timor Sea arrangements, maritime boundary issues, and the Bayundan, Timor Sea Treaty, and all of that. So it was, so that came as a shock. But other than that, in spite of that, then the two sides, after the commotion of the discovery of the espionage situation, the two sides, showing statesmanship, decide to negotiate under UN mediation on the maritime boundary, which is concluded as we wanted, medium line, and so on. So the relationship is good. During the pandemic, in the first few days, weeks, the country that has been most actively involved through the Australian Embassy in Dili, DFAT, have been very supportive. The Australian Embassy, stay put, no one left. Australian doctors, the wonderful people who have been here. I met many of them with their children here. And in spite of the unknown, you know, we wouldn't know what is going to happen. Timor could have been overwhelmed by COVID. And yet I was touched when I went to see Dr. Bethany, her husband, Jeremy, and the 4 lovely kids. And they said, we are going to stay. And I was really worried for them, you know. I thought they should leave. But no, that's when the people of Timor need us. So Australia has been good during this COVID crisis. But luckily, you know, with God help, geography helping, we have had very, very few cases. For 3 months, we didn't have a case. Now we have 2 positives, all imported from Indonesia. No death. Even the positive cases we had, they were all mild, all treated humanely, attentively by our doctors and foreign doctors who are here, including Australians. So no panic here, no pandemic in Timor-Leste. So this also partly thanks to Australian assistance, but not only Australia. China, United States, the European Union, and the whole UN system, in particular WHO, who has been superb here, and UNICEF, UNDP, everybody in a true international partnership. It shows the importance of multilateral institutions in situations like this. So Timor has been, I think, a good showcase in a very small way of how international partnership, multilateral bodies can perform important tasks critical to prevent humanitarian catastrophes.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos-Horta. Alan, did you have a follow-up question there?
Mr. Ramos-Horta, I think it's extremely generous of you to take your consideration away from the history of Australia's relationship with Timor-Leste. You referred to the dark cloud that descended and that took us to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. But there have been a couple of other dark clouds, one of them being, of course, mentioned in Bernard's excellent book, which I'm just holding up for everybody to see, Oil Under Troubled Water, where certainly the Australian government's relationship with the Suharto government back in the early 70s is chronicled by Bernard. And of course, the Oil Under Troubled Waters refers almost directly to comments made by Peter Galbraith, the son of the famous J.K. Galbraith, who described Australia's grasping after the Greater Sunrise resources as unconscionable. So my question to you, I think, really is, are we doing enough, do you think, to restore the kind of trust that should exist between Timor-Leste and Australia as we move forward, not only through the pandemic, but even more importantly, to the economic reconstruction of East Timor?
Well, I wouldn't want to be ungrateful to Australia or to any country. If someone gives me $1, I have to thank. If someone gives me $1 million, I have to thank. And that's applicable to in any situation. And in the last few years, Australian aid has increased, improved qualitatively. We have had more Timorese students going to Australia, also under our own scholarship. We have had continuing very good military-to-military cooperation. One of the very best aspects of partnership with Australia is the training of our military and police. The East Timor Eye program, which is primarily Australian civil society, the Australasian College of Surgeons and Physicians, led by Dr. Nitin Verma, my friend from Tasmania. And today, one of the best, I think, the most salient, visible, successful story in Timor is the eye center in Timor-Leste. We started with 0 Timorese eye doctor, now more than 10. One studied at Sydney Uni, and they perform cataract surgeries, which we didn't do 10, 20 years ago. So that's thanks to partly Australian government funding, but partly Australian private sector. But of course, being Timor what it is, closest to Australia, country completely destroyed in 1999, well, Australian aid should have been much bigger, like a mini Marshall Plan for Timor to reconstruct our roads, airports, health infrastructure like hospitals, electricity, and so on. And but this was not done. So it has been Timor-Leste with the money we generated from Timor Sea by UNDAN that we have invested billions already in roads. Now you can travel from Dili to Baucau in an hour and a half, when before several hours. And we have invested in the electricity. Now 75, 80% of the country is covered with electricity. This could have been done by Australia easily, or any other donor. And in Australia, you people, particularly government, always talk about growing Chinese influence in Timor-Leste. Well, you know, countries like Timor-Leste, countries in Pacific, elsewhere around the world, we are sort of colorblind in the sense, you know, who helped who and who come to help us. We welcome with gratitude, with open arms. If Australia count every cent before it decides to help Timor-Leste, or United States count every cent, or look at us with some, how you say that, well, Timor-Leste is not so important, and let's put our money elsewhere in Indonesia. Well, we have to look to China. Unfortunately, China is around. On the other hand, I also say, you know, ironically, you know, Australia is always sort of paranoid about Chinese influence in Timor-Leste. But actually, we are the ones, we in Timor-Leste, particularly me, are very worried about growing Chinese influence in Australia. And we are worried about that. You even lease away the Darwin port to the Chinese. Can you imagine if we lease the Dili Harbor to the Chinese? You know, heavens and skies would fall on us. So this is only to say that we are closer to Australia. We are in desperate need. We continue to be in desperate need. So please increase significantly the financial, economic assistance to Timor-Leste. For instance, I've argued over many years, first with John Howard, with Alexander Downer and the others, to help set up in Timor-Leste vocational schools of Australian standards. Because in Timor-Leste, everybody wants to go to university. And when in fact we lack a lot of vocational. And we should take hundreds of Timorese to study TAFE in Australia. It has not been done, has not been responded. Some Timorese already working, you know, in Australia. So anyway, I don't want to deviate from the main subject of this conversation today, but only to say Australia's aid to Timor-Leste has been wonderful, exemplary, but it could do much more. It can still do much more in the months, years to come.
Thank you very much. Bernard Collaery, my next question will be for you. Alan just pointed out you've written that marvellous book, Oil Under Troubled Water. How would you characterise Australia's diplomatic behaviour?
Well, of course, the Dili matters are only symbolic of years and years of failed foreign policy in our region. It's difficult to know where it starts, but certainly in the Barwick years when Barwick was both Attorney General and Foreign Minister, immensely powerful in cabinet, and also very well connected in the petroleum exploration boardrooms in Australia as a commercial silk. And that's where the decline starts. We get to the Howard Downey years when there's a massive narrow prism interest in trade, that is expanding Australia's liquid natural gas trade, and covetous eyes on the assets of this impoverished nation. I mean, the moral decline reaches its depths in those years. But I agree with José and Alan that we really need to look to the future. Timor-Leste has learnt the lessons, and it's very interesting to see that the Timor-Leste governing parties seem to be well and previously well aware of the Chinese influences. Of course, I witnessed them in my years there, and have been reactive to it rather than our foreign ministry. This is a foreign ministry that only 3 years ago was pressing to have an extradition treaty with China. My book chronicles 50 years of incompetent and at times, especially in our close region, deceptive foreign policy. I mean, our foreign policy in the Pacific region during the Howard years was disastrous. There were rising sea level issues. We had excellent Australian companies, construction companies, skilled in building marinas and rehabilitating reef developments in tidal areas of Australia. If our foreign aid program had moved in to help with the atoll rehabilitations throughout the Pacific areas where the threatened sea level issues are, we would have certainly narrowed the access of the Chinese authorities where they are now throughout the atoll Pacific doing the work that we should have done in our own region. Utterly incompetent foreign policy during the Howard Downey years in the Asia Pacific region. We have a marvelous cast of diplomats, some of the greatest. I've served with them, serving very well in Washington, London, in all those hotspots, Tokyo. But those who've been focused on the region have shown a distressing level of incompetence. And that is where we have to learn. I mean, the lesson is not for the Timorese to take away and gnaw away at what could have been. It's really for us now to start the inquiries, isolate the officials who've been involved and who are still there. These are the same officials that I well know, well in the fore at the moment, who've been heavily involved in pushing for the extradition treaty with China, who've been allowing the Chinese to access throughout our region, and who now, amazingly, do a complete somersault, and now with semaphore diplomacy are working at antagonizing and annoying the Chinese in a very semaphore fashion that lacks subtlety and appears to be really breastbeating by those who've been involved in our supine diplomacy towards China. Now, Timor, therefore, and the issue that involves me at the moment and Witness K, is symbolic of failed foreign policy. I keep saying that. It's not a narrow issue of simple oversight, although that's an important issue of our agencies. It's really whether we are going to weed out those responsible in the foreign ministry, because as we know, some of these mandarins just survive the political vicissitudes. They prosper under any government, and particularly with ministers who become pliable to the sedulous voices of those who claim to have current experience. There are eminent former diplomats. There are eminent persons, you're one of them, Alan, for that matter, who should be allowed to take the reins, even temporarily, to get the ship right in Australia. That's what we need. And I guess there'll be casualties along the way. And while this group fight for survival, clawing as hard as they can to try and justify their position now, the fact is that history will not favour them, Ebony.
Thanks, Bernard.
We need that reform.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I will point out we've got close to 1,900 people participating in this webinar today. Thank you all for joining us. I know you're from across the country. We've got people from Darwin to Hawaii to New York to Canberra to Guringai country in northern Sydney. So welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Alan, I know you've got some questions about spying in general that perhaps you might want to put to Bernard.
Yes, I think, Bernard, you've really given us a waterfront to look at. And I'm particularly interested in the implications of what you have said for the mindset that we have in Australia around the conduct of our foreign policy, and how perhaps we might need to change that mindset a bit if we are to build trust and to move into a post-COVID world, which is a very disrupted one, on a much more constructive basis. In particular, I'm particularly interested in any observations you might have in the fact that we seem to be more interested to gather information about our region than perhaps actually to do anything about the information we actually gather, and particularly in the light of what His Excellency Mr. Ramos-Horta said, investing in the future of our neighbours. You would recall, I'm sure, that in, I think, 2013, Australia found itself in the embarrassing position of having its ability to listen to the private telephone of the President of Indonesia. That was made public, and everybody was sort of scrambling for what they might say. And then just a short while later, the United States was in the same boat, listening into the private conversations of Angela Merkel. In both cases, friends of the countries doing listening. I wonder whether we should, in fact, think about the extent to which gathering intelligence in that kind of way simply creates a major distraction to the real business in the conduct of a modern foreign policy. And I'm sure you've got much to say on that, Bernard, but here you go.
Well, that's the narrow prism. You've got a very small clique who are intelligence fed and who want to direct the operation. Now, José spoke eloquently about health and all the issues that Australia has assisted in Timor with, electoral reform and all those other areas. Now, notably, they are all other Australian agencies, particularly our defence services, who've done a wonderful job. But there's been a narrow focus by the Department of Foreign Affairs, which needs a clean out. That's the real issue. All these other initiatives are seen as a way of dealing with different issues that the Foreign Ministry encourages, but certainly misses the whole focus. And we can't ever do anything but try and develop a diplomatic service in our region that is devoted to promoting Australia's best interests and not having I mean, my heart sank in the last year or two on two issues. When Mr. Morrison said he'd model his government on Mr. Howard's, and secondly, when apparently learning nothing from the debacle with Timor-Leste, Mr. Morrison said that with rising sea levels, we could give more entry to Pacific Islanders to pick fruit. I mean, we've got to get away from this patronising, overbearing policy approach to our region. And speaking of SBY finding his wife's phones being monitored, look, I had some privileged accesses. I was in Bali, same time as Chinana Guzmao at that time, and Julia Gillard was there too. It was the 12th of October, anniversary of the Bali bombing. And look, I want to say this. The Indonesian president and the Timorese leader spoke about the need to assist Australia to get the then casual vacancy on the Security Council. Now, as lawyer for Timor-Leste, I was instructed and was privy to going easy on the issue so that Australia's disgraceful conduct would not come to a public eye before the vote that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard so urgently wanted for that casual vacancy. Here was two very mature, sensible regional leaders deciding, listen, we'll just not press that, particularly with the Lusophone countries, not press that with the Muslim countries. We'll look past it for the greater good. And I left those meetings we had in Bali realising, well, there's a bit more maturity here than exists in Canberra.
We'll move very shortly to questions from the audience, and Elizabeth Byrne, if you're on the line, I'll come to you very shortly. But before we do go to those questions, I did want to ask you, Mr. Ramos-Horta, about Australia. The Australian Institute has done earlier webinars on securitization, the practice of many modern governments using law enforcement and military tools to address what are essentially problems of civil society. Do you think there is a trend amongst some democratic governments to assert their power and the prerogatives of the state at the expense of civil rights and democratic freedoms? And are human and personal rights at risk as governments tend to legislate or over-legislate to enhance national security?
Yes, certainly if you look at the trend in Australia, the way Australian Federal Police crack down on media, on Bernard Collaery, the way we see developments in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America. Ironically, I would say Africa continent is where you see much less negative trends in the democratic development. From what I know, I follow not in depth, but so far, no one in Africa, no government is using the pandemic to curtail freedom of expression and the democracy and so on. Of course, throughout Africa, you have some different situations that already there before the pandemic of authoritarian rule. But by and large, it has been remarkable. While throughout Europe, of course, with exceptions, but in Europe, but I would say that these phenomena are always temporary. You look at the United States, while, and by the way, I see Charlie Shiner here. Charlie Shiner is a great friend of Timor-Leste. I noticed he's in New York. I thought he was in Timor-Leste. Charlie, be careful there in the United States with COVID. Look after yourself. And Jill is his wife. Both manage this wonderful NGO in Timor-Leste called La Hamutuk, which it monitors, screen government policies, particularly financing, the budget and so on. So in this regard, I believe I followed the situation in the US, like almost everyone in the world is interested. People fighting back. It's incredible, the stamina and the strength of the institutions, politics, of the judiciary, of the media is relentless. People in the streets. So when I look at the United States, I don't look just of how unpredictable, dangerous President Trump is, and that is obvious. But I look also what fantastic, strong democratic institutions. So that's why I say many of these problems are transient, transitional. It's not going to be a doomsday for democracy in Europe or United States or anywhere. In Asia, it's going to change. In the Philippines, people are fighting back. And, so these are phenomena that happen time to time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramos-Horta. We'll now move to questions from the audience. I believe I've got Elizabeth Byrne there. Can you hear me, Elizabeth?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can. What's your question?
Just a question for Mr. Ramos-Horta. How do you and even people in East Timor feel about the fact that Bernard Collaery and witness K are being prosecuted for revealing the information that there was espionage on your government over the oil and gas treaty negotiations?
Did you hear that? Would you like me to repeat it?
Yeah, should I answer it?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, obviously in Timor-Leste, everyone that followed this aberration, the situation is very unfair treatment of witness K and Bernard Collaery. We are profoundly shocked because we were supposed to have reached a way forward in the relationship overall through the UN mediated conclusion of the Timor Sea Treaty, everything that happened before and leading to the agreement on the treaty should be put aside. But instead, the government continued to pursue trial in secret of witness K and Bernard Collaery. I know any thinking person, understand the sensitive nature of intelligence. We know that. If Australia were to spy on North Korea, or China, or Russia, or United States, you can understand. Obviously these are real security problems. But to spy on Timor-Leste on behalf of Woodside, on behalf of ConocoPhillips, on behalf of oil companies, is a bit like, you have a poor old lady somewhere in an Australian neighborhood, 80 years old, poor, living off a very meager pension. And then Australia tried to extract money from that old lady. Well, Timor-Leste was on our knees, and we needed a very fair arrangement. And it was obvious the median line was under the law of the sea treaty, was what was already accepted in the later part 20th century, 21st century. Australia persisted, no and no. Of course, at the time, our Prime Minister, Dr. Maria Alkatiri, and myself, we went along with the preliminary transitional arrangements so that we could develop by UNDAN, which gave us the billions of dollars that we've been using. But we never agreed. We never agreed on Australian claims to a maritime boundary based on its claims of continental shelf. That's why we decided, okay, we postpone this matter. And then came Shanana as Prime Minister. He felt very strongly about this from day one of our independence. He went along with the Bayundan agreement, the Timor Sea Treaty agreement, but he was very unhappy with the way it was being managed. I recall some of his very, very strong criticisms of Australia back then in the beginning of our independence. Well, he proved right. So we should put all of this behind and please show wisdom, show honesty, compassion, if you wish, to let witness K live his life as an honorable patriot of Australia, stop harassing Bernard Collaery, let him go back to his law practice and to have a normal life and honor them. If I were president of Timor-Leste, I'm no longer, I might be again, who knows. If I were the president of Timor-Leste, I would have already decorated these two men, Bernard Collaery and witness K, with the highest award of Timor-Leste. I would have done that. And that without offense to Australia. And in Canberra, they know I'm a great friend of Australia. But as great friends, as husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, as friends, we always sometimes have a dispute. we disagree. So because I'm a great fan of Australia doesn't mean I have to agree with everything Australia does. So I don't agree at all with the way they have been treated is un-Australian.
Thank you very much. I think this next question is probably for you, Bernard Collaery. Tim Diamond is asking about secret trials in Australia and whether they've been used before now. And I just wonder if you could also comment, without going into your own case, on the implications for the legal profession of secret trials, but also ones that involve lawyers representing their clients.
Well, thanks, Tim. The foreign interference laws, which is part of the breastfeeding by the very same pro-China group within power now, have changed the definitions such, to put it shortly, if you're a lawyer in Australia acting for a sovereign state, say Kiribati or somewhere, and that state is in dispute with Australia, and even the words economic activities define it, then you may be committing sabotage or espionage. I mean, the legal profession is shocked and astounded by the breadth of these laws. And so I make that comment vis-a-vis the legal profession. The other implication, of course, for us is secret trials. Now, I went back to as the Japanese approached Australia, the Australian Parliament passed the National Security Act 1939. The brutality of the invading army had been witnessed in Nanking, in China and elsewhere, and even facing that brutality, and I say that vis-a-vis 9/11 issues, the Australian Parliament made sure that in national security trials in Australia, the judge would have the final say on what would be heard in camera. The judge would. Faced with the possibility of invasion and the brutality of the Japanese army, we did not go so far as to undermine our constitutional rights as to deprive people of a public jury trial, for instance, which I'm denied, right? So there is the issue that squarely confronts our nation. But because of our general apathy, I must say, until someone's wife, husband, son, daughter is faced with what I'm faced with, there won't be a real consciousness of the threat to democracy that has emerged from the clique. I call them the clique. There's only 4 or 5 of them, and they are running this country, and not one of them is an elected official. Not one of them. And they have the ear of the ministries, and just like we grandparents read these bedtime horror stories, they are reading their incantations to some of our political leaders who are going along with it. Now, as for, we only have 1 or 2 constitutional rights. We have no Bill of Rights, unfortunately. One is Section 80 of the Constitution that guarantees me, charged with an indictable offence, a jury trial. Well, what kind of jury trial is it if the public can't be there to see 12 of their fellow citizens, peers, casting judgment on someone? The jury right in the Constitution is a full right of the jury to see all the evidence. Yet in my trial, there is apparently some judge-only evidence that I shan't see, the jury can't see, but the judge can. I mean, are Australians generally aware of how far we've gone? We've gone much further than all of the Western democracies in this regard. And why? We didn't do that as the Japanese army approached. Why and for what reason have we done it now? For terrorism? Well, as we know, sadly, most of the recorded terrorist incidents relate to persons with severe personality disorders or psychiatric conditions. And they are matters of grave concern. They must involve the full resources of our intelligence agencies. And I'm all for the focus, as you know. I'm supportive of effective intelligence analytical work, but not where they find themselves corralled by a clique and fed and harnessed to public corporations. Now, the Five Eyes Agreement specifically, that is Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand, who run a very effective signals net, and they have a protocol that proscribes, prevents the Five Eyes system being used for national corporate support. I can say no more, but that hopefully is sound and working. But no such protocol necessarily applies to the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. I can say no more, but there is clearly a massive need to review our intelligence services. Now, the Australian Institute put out a release yesterday in today's Canberra Times, I think, that talked about an independent 2017 review. Well, there were two reviewers, Michael Lestrange and Stephen Merchant. Now, Michael Lestrange has a career history in national security issues, intelligence, so he's well informed, capable, competent, and we all heard him on Frank Kelly the other morning explaining why Rio Tinto's destruction of a cave, a 40,000-year-old indigenous cave, resulted from, quote, systemic error. Well, in my website somewhere is my analysis of the refuge of systemic problems. It's the refuge and the cover used to ensure that individual responsibility is not assigned. And that's what is massively required and should happen with, if I've got to go to trial and K2, there should be an analysis of who's responsible for all of this, who's really responsible, and why should witness K have had to take the running? Why should a noble, decent, patriotic person have had to take the running? And why, as that person's lawyer, should I have had to take the running? If we had effective oversight mechanisms, there might be some others in the dock. I'm precluded under these 9/11 induced laws from saying anything more.
Thanks, Bernard. We've got a question here. It might be more for you, Mr. Ramos-Horta, from Robert Richter, QC, and a few others, commenting on the difference between Attorney General Christian Porter deciding to allow this prosecution to go ahead compared to previous Attorney Generals who apparently had more reticence, but that essentially being a political decision. So I wonder if we could get your reflections on that decision to proceed, and is it a political one? But also to the point that Bernard was making there on oversight of intelligence agencies, because I think on the one hand, we've got, you know, the political decisions that drive intelligence agencies, but also Parliament should have the responsibility for oversight of some of these things. And as we've shown, Australia has some of the weakest oversight of any of those Five Eyes nations.
Obviously, and pardon my ignorance, I'm not terribly familiar with I say the hierarchy of responsibilities of authority in Australia, who is who making the decisions. But regardless, it's a highly political issue. It's very little to do with Australian national security. What is the national security about to spying on a poor country to get advantage for oil companies and so on? Even the profits that Australia would have made on the Timor Sea to the disadvantage of Timor-Leste didn't even go to the Australian people, goes to the oil companies. And in this particular case, initially was primarily to an American company, ConocoPhillips. So it's absolutely entirely oil and money, zero to do with Australian national security. So now that we have resolved the Timor Sea dispute in an amicable way, so many countries praising Australia and Timor-Leste, we have shown two other countries that have a similar maritime boundary dispute that the best way to resolve the dispute, where maritime or land boundary dispute, is either through bilateral negotiations or, failing that, a third-party mediation. In this case, the United Nations or any regional organization to which everyone agreed. Having done all of that, why pursuing this case against Witness K and Bernard Collaery? So it's political. What they gain from it, I have no idea what they could gain from it. Get only bad feeling, you know, among many people in Australia, and they could raise doubts in Timor-Leste. Why? You know, we were the ones who were the victims. We are victims of Indonesian occupation for 24 years. We reconciled with Indonesia, the best possible relationship of any two countries. No anger, no hatred towards Indonesia. Australia sided with Indonesia for a long, long time, then redeemed itself in 1999 by leading the international force to Timor-Leste, and then turn around, spying on a poverty-stricken country, and this, many years after that, still refuse to simply file the case and let the two go free, let Bernard Collaery and Witness K go free.
Thank you.
As the French would say, j'ai aucune idée. I have the slightest, I don't have the slightest idea why they're persisting with this situation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ramos-Horta. I think I've got Christopher Naus there. Can you hear me? Are you able to unmute yourself? Do you have a question?
Hi, yeah, I just wondered, and this might be a question for both of you. Labor has made some noises about this case in sort of recent months, but up until that point has been noticeably quiet. And I wondered whether either of you sort of felt that was a shortcoming from Labor, and whether you'd like to see them make more noise about this, or whether you might be able to explain what might lay behind Labor's sort of hesitance to get involved here.
Bernard, would you like to start?
Yes, Chris, that was a loaded one. Well, I think it probably in electoral terms, being a rather a cynic, the Labor Party might like to see this issue rolling all the way along to the next election. But putting aside that cynicism, I very much welcomed the Labor leader's statement. The French, José, I'll return one of these quotes. The French would say, the Shadow Attorney-General, Marc Dreyfus, is coincé. He, of course, and Bob Carr made that extraordinary revelation in May 2013 of Timor-Leste's complaint. It was never Timor-Leste who revealed the issue. And it would be marvelous if Marc Dreyfus could come forward and say what the briefing was that allowed him, as a distinguished lawyer, an eminent silk and first law officer, to say in that media release that Australia had always acted in good faith, quote, in certain negotiations. Now, I don't for a word believe that Marc was properly briefed. Now, who was responsible in those terms? And I invite the Labor leader to make that inquiry, Chris. How did the current shadow attorney get to say that which all Australians, I think, without exception, would believe stems from certainly a briefing that didn't include crucial facts? So that's the first comment about, in terms of your question, Chris. The other comment, which, you know, I think José might have difficulty replying to, because you're talking about bilateral, you're invoking bilateral issues here. really, well, I'll pass to you, Jose. You've got the rest of the answer.
Would you like to add anything, Mr. Ramos-Horta?
No, not really. Maybe we'll let the listeners or the other participants ask questions or comment.
I've got another question here from Peter Maywald, and I've got only time for one more question after this. We're nearly out of time. But he asks, how can the Australian people be assured that justice will be done when all or parts of a criminal trial are held in secret? Mr. Ramos-Horta, would you like to comment on secret trials and their implications for justice?
Well, you know, Australia is supposed to be open democracy, open society, and when you conduct secret trials, they know, we used to read that about North Korea. We don't read about these secret trials in a country like Australia. So I'm, you know, being an innocent, naive person, I get totally confused when you have a secret trials in Australia. I'm not surprised, you know, when secret trials in North Korea, but in Australia, and that is really mind-boggling. And so it's a waste of Australia's resources, Australia's goodwill, goodwill towards Australia, to perpetuate, to persist on this very unjust case against Bernard Collaery and the witness K. Please just drop it. It's a political decision to be made by the Prime Minister and the Attorney General. They know they can do it. If it were involved, and I had involved some Australian citizen who was found to be spying for North Korea, you know, selling Australian military technology or economic technology to North Korea, to China, to Russia, well, you know, you can understand. But when someone like Witness K acted on his conscience, you know, let me tell you, you know, I don't want to take too long, but, you know, many, many years ago, maybe 30 years ago or less, in Darwin, Timorese called Stanislao da Silva. Later, he became minister in Timor-Leste. He's well known. He was operating radio from Darwin, Northern Territory, to Timor-Leste, which was against Australian law. The radio was confiscated by Australian Federal Police, and Stanislao was put on trial in Northern Territory in Darwin, and that judge in Northern Territory, he said, set him free. He's not a criminal. He's a patriot trying to help his country. So, and sadly, I never contacted that judge. I always want. Many years later, I put a note in my Facebook page, and then someone responded, so no, he passed away already. In England, 4 women, they are not all British, they entered the British aerospace airplane factory. They damaged one airplane that had been sold to Indonesia. That was 25 years ago. Well, everybody expected them to be tried and sentenced to 12 years in jail. I was a defense witness in the case. When I walked into the courtroom in Liverpool, UK, looking at the judge, he looked very British, very austere, very unfriendly. I thought, oh God, these women are going to go to jail. Well, after the case, the judge dismissed the case, accepted that the 4 women acted on their conscience. And this was the first time in the British history that a case of conscience was invoked and accepted by the judge. So the 4 women were set free. Witness K acted on his conscience. Bernard Collaery acted on his conscience. So they should set them free.
Thank you. And we might have to leave it there, but Bernard, we've got a number of people talking about how stressful this must be for you and just inquiring how you're going.
I'm trying to get good sleep at night. Can I say one thing? The poison that's being floated is that Kay didn't act on his conscience. That's all I want to say. That's a poisonous lie, an utter lie. And it's the sort of lies we used to hear during Glasnost and Perestroika from Moscow whenever there was a Soviet defector. Moscow would say he was chasing promotion. He was took the embassy funds, ran off with the ambassador's wife, something like that. And I suspect that what is being put about is that Kay didn't act on his conscience. That is an absolute lie, absolute lie. And I hope the ministers who are being briefed listen to this today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will have to wrap it up there. Thank you to His Excellency, José Ramos-Horta, to Mr. Bernard Collaery, and to Alan Beam for joining us today. And thank you everyone for your great questions and for being respectful of the limitations that we imposed upon today's discussion. We had close to 2,000 people. Thank you all so much for coming. You can buy Bernard's book, Oil Under Troubled Waters, The Timor Sea Intrigue, from Melbourne University Press, Paper Chain here in Manuka, or at any good bookstore. And supporters of Bernard Collaery, there is a petition that you can sign urging the government to drop the prosecution. That's at bernardcollaerysupporters.org. You can find the petition there. Please join us over the next few weeks for some more exciting webinars. I'll be taking a week's leave next week, so my colleague from Tasmania, Leanne Mitchell, will be filling in for our webinar with Craig Rucastle. That's next Wednesday, the 9th of September at 11 a.m. That's a plan for Planet A with Craig Rucastle. And make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to your podcasts. And please stay 1.5 meters away, wear a mask if you can, keep washing your hands, and stay safe out there, everyone. And thanks again for all your interest today. And thanks again to all of our guests for your time. We really appreciate it. Thanks very much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.